For 25 years, Parker Stevenson rarely said a public word about his marriage to Kirstie Alley. He didn't respond to tabloid speculation during their divorce, didn't weigh in when she spoke openly in later years about other men she had loved while they were still married, and generally let the world file him under a simple, incomplete label, her ex-husband. It would have been easy, and perhaps even understandable, for him to say nothing at all when the news of her death broke. Instead, so when Kirstie Alley died of colon cancer on December 5, 2022, at the age of 71, the way Parker chose to respond told you almost as much about him as anything he could have said in a lengthy interview. He didn't write a long remembrance. He didn't try to reclaim the spotlight or reframe their story for an audience that had spent decades only half understanding it. He posted 6 sentences. Alongside a throwback photo of the two of them from years earlier, Parker wrote on Instagram, "Dear Kirstie, I am so grateful for our years together and for the 2 incredibly beautiful children and now grandchildren that we have. You will be missed. With love, Parker." That was the entirety of his public statement. No lengthy reflection on what their marriage had meant, no attempt to correct the record on their divorce, nothing performative. Just gratitude and quiet acknowledgement, the kind of restraint that tends to come from someone who has already spent years privately processing something that never fully resolved for him. That restraint stood out even more once you looked at what everyone else posted that same day. Ted Danson, her longtime Cheers co-star, told reporters he'd been on a plane and, in a rare moment, watched an old episode of the show featuring one of Kirstie's most memorable performances, only to learn of her death the moment he landed. He said she had made him laugh 30 years earlier and made him laugh again that very afternoon. John Travolta, her co-star from the Look Who's Talking films, wrote that she had been one of the most special relationships of his life and that he believed they would see each other again. Jamie Lee Curtis, Kirstie's Scream Queens castmate, described her as a great comic presence on screen and an even better presence off it. Every one of those tributes was heartfelt and specific, but none of them carried quite the same weight as Parker's 6 sentences, because none of those people had shared a home, raised children, or built a life with her the way he once had. To understand why those 6 sentences landed the way they did, it helps to go back to where the relationship actually began, in a Los Angeles bar in the early 1980s. By the time Kirstie Alley met Parker Stevenson, she had already survived one of the worst years of her life. Alley had grown up in Wichita, Kansas, tried college twice without finishing, and eventually moved to Los Angeles with only a couple $1,000s to her name, working odd jobs, including interior design, while chasing a career in front of the camera. In October of 1981, her parents were driving in Kansas when a drunk driver struck their car head-on. Her mother, Lillian, was killed at the scene. Her father, Robert, was severely injured. At the time, Kirstie was in the middle of a series of auditions for the role of Lieutenant Saavik in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and rather than withdraw entirely, she reportedly told her agent to inform the studio that her mother had died and her father was dying, and that if Paramount still wanted to see her, she would come in once the funeral was over. She got the role, and it launched the career that would eventually make her a household name. It's a detail that captures something essential about who she was long before television audiences ever met her. A woman who had already learned, in the most painful way possible, that grief and ambition could exist in the same breath, and that she was not going to let tragedy take away the one thing she had been working toward. So when Kirstie spotted Parker Stevenson across a crowded room not long after, already in the middle of a date with someone else, it wasn't just a passing attraction. By most accounts, she walked directly over to him, and he left his date behind to dance with her instead, a decision that would go on to define both of their lives for the next decade and a half. Parker was not, at the time, the person most casual observers assumed he was. He had grown up in Philadelphia and attended Brooks School before enrolling at Princeton University, where he studied architecture rather than acting, planning on a career built around design and structure rather than cameras and scripts. He hadn't set out to become a teen idol. He later described having little to no early interest in performing at all, saying acting was never really part of his plan and that he was fully committed to the idea of becoming an architect. But a small role in the 1976 film Lifeguard changed his trajectory in a way he hadn't anticipated, and by 1977, he was cast alongside Sean Cassidy in the Hardy Boys/Nancy Drew Mysteries, which turned him into one of the most recognizable young actors on American television almost overnight and pulled him permanently away from the architecture career he had once planned. When that show ended after a few seasons, Parker later admitted he found himself burned out and uncertain what came next, unsure whether the version of himself the public had gotten to know was one he even recognized anymore. In that meeting, Kirstie, with her conviction and enthusiasm for her own work, helped restore something in him that he felt he had lost along the way. They dated for roughly 2 years before marrying on December 22, 1983. From early on, it was clear they were, in nearly every sense, opposites. Kirstie was loud, expressive, and unmistakably the center of gravity in any room she entered. Parker was quieter, more reserved, and by his own admission, more comfortable staying in the background rather than commanding attention. Ted Danson once described Kirstie during that period as a combination of a biker and an Earth mother, which is about as accurate a summary as anyone ever gave. The couple lived together for years and eventually settled into a large home where Kirstie kept an extensive menagerie of rescue animals, a household that reflected her larger-than-life personality in nearly every corner. In 1990, Kirstie experienced a miscarriage roughly 3 months in her first pregnancy, a loss she later wrote about candidly, describing how difficult it was to move past and how it stayed with her for years afterward. 2 years later, in 1992, she and Parker adopted a son, William True. Their daughter, Lily, followed in 1994. Fatherhood, by most accounts, became the role that fit Parker more naturally than any part he had ever played on screen, a grounding presence in a household that otherwise moved at Kirstie's pace. Even as they built a family, the underlying differences between them never fully disappeared, and Kirstie was candid in later years about 2 relationships that complicated her marriage without, by her own account, ever becoming physically unfaithful. She spoke publicly about falling in love with her North and South co-star Patrick Swayze, while both were married to other people, saying she believed that kind of emotional entanglement was, in some ways, worse than a physical affair because of how it put both marriages at risk. She was even more open about her feelings for John Travolta, her co-star in the Look Who's Talking films, later saying in interviews that it took her years to stop thinking of him romantically and that she came close to leaving her life behind to be with him. She insisted publicly, more than once, that nothing physical had happened with either man. Parker never publicly disputed her account, but it's not hard to imagine the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being married to someone who has said, on the record, that another man was the great love of her life, while still choosing, year after year, to stay. By November of 1996, after 13 years together, Parker and Kirstie separated, and the divorce that followed was far messier than their joint statement about remaining friends and devoted co-parents initially suggested it would be. Custody arrangements for their 2 young children, along with the financial terms of the split, became a genuine legal battle that dragged on for months and reportedly involved disputes over mediation methods and jurisdictional questions between different states. It was, by nearly every account, a difficult and drawn-out process for 2 people who had once built an entire life together. The marriage was formally dissolved in 1997. More than a year later, Parker gave an interview to People magazine that remains one of the more candid things either of them said publicly about the aftermath, acknowledging that he and Kirstie were not exactly friends at that point, though they spoke regularly about their children, and that he genuinely didn't know whether real friendship between them would ever be possible again. After the divorce, Parker didn't retreat from public life. He returned to acting, spent additional seasons on Baywatch, moved into directing television episodes, and later took on a recurring role on the Netflix series Greenhouse Academy. He also found a second chapter in his personal life. He eventually met Lisa Schoen, a professional chef who had spent years working in food styling and catering, including a stint cooking for New York Yankees legend Derek Jeter. The 2 married on September 29, 2018, at a vineyard in Los Olivos, California, and honeymooned in Israel, settling into a quieter life that seemed to suit him well. Kirstie's path after the divorce was, by contrast, louder and more public, in keeping with who she had always been. She led her own sitcom, competed on Dancing with the Stars, appeared on British reality television, became a public face for weight loss programs, and never stopped drawing attention wherever she went, whether she wanted it or not. What kept Parker and Kirstie permanently connected, though, was never Hollywood. It was their children. William True and Lily both grew up close to both of their parents and went on to build lives of their own, largely away from the entertainment industry that had shaped their childhoods. True became a father in 2016, making Parker and Kirstie grandparents together for the first time, and Lily had 2 children of her own in the years that followed, with her second child arriving just months after Kirstie's death, a grandchild she never had the chance to meet. When Parker spoke to Closer magazine, roughly a year after Kirstie's passing, he described it as a genuine tragedy that she wasn't around longer, especially for their children, adding that no one is ever fully prepared to lose a parent no matter their age or how much life they've already lived. Notably, he didn't center himself in that reflection. He spoke about their kids first, which tracked with a pattern that had defined him for decades. Fatherhood was always the role he wore most naturally, more comfortably than any character he had ever played on screen. Looking at the full arc of their story, it's easy to understand why Parker's simple Instagram tribute resonated the way it did. This wasn't a man performing grief for an audience or trying to insert himself into a moment that belonged to Kirstie's fans and colleagues. It was someone who had loved a genuinely larger-than-life person, built a family with her despite being nearly opposite in temperament, endured a difficult and public divorce, and still, a quarter-century later, felt enough gratitude to put it into 6 honest sentences. Kirstie Alley spent her career being described as unforgettable, chaotic, generous, and impossible to ignore, a woman who filled every room she entered and left an impression on nearly everyone she met. Parker Stevenson spent his life being the quieter half of that equation, the person willing to stand slightly out of frame while the world's attention gravitated toward her instead. When he finally spoke, briefly and without fanfare, it wasn't a break in decades of silence for the sake of attention or public sympathy. It was simply a husband, decades removed from marriage, but never fully removed for what they had built together, saying goodbye in the only way that ever really fit him, quietly, honestly, and without asking anyone to notice.